Get my 6. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Homesteading Off the Grid and another reading from October Nights 2. 31 more tales for the Halloween season. It's actually almost evening here. It's very late afternoon as of this recording. Beautiful view behind me here. This is where I wanted to do yesterday's reading, but gentleman over there was mowing grass, and I just didn't want the background noise. I'm going to try to capture this view of our property a little earlier in the day than I'm capturing it right now, because when the sun is actually shining on everything, you can see everything in its full autumn glory. It's absolutely beautiful. So today's story is called Papa Finally Returned. It was originally titled Irene's Story. And I should have dedicated this story to the everlasting memory of Irene. She was a beautiful woman inside and out, as you're going to find out here as I read the story, if you haven't read it already, in your copy of the book, which is available with an autograph from our Etsy store. Links in the description box below. You can get it in Kindle or print from Amazon. There are 3 main settings in the stories for this, and I guess it's because it's where I've largely spent my life. West by God, Virginia, Appalachian, the beautiful Blue Ridge Mountains here, Virginia. But Irene's story takes place in the Philippines. It's very much a true story. It was just, I don't know how I remember these things. People often ask, how do you come up with your ideas? Well, mostly because these things happen. So the question I would ask myself is, how do I remember these things? I have no clue how I remember this story after all these years. But I did, and I think you'll agree that even though it took place 9,000 miles away, where they don't know what fall is like because it's summer every day of the year, it did take place in October, ironically, and it's a ghostly tale very fitting for a collection of stories such as this. October 15, Papa Finally Returned, originally titled Irene's Story. There are people we meet in our lives with whom we feel we already have a connection, even though we've never met them before. Does this happen due to some sort of odd deja vu? Is it a case of one empath meeting another? If so, does this mean that this experience does not occur among non-empaths? I cannot answer these questions for certain, but I can relay many stories that involve having had such experiences. One I will relate at this time has to do with a 90-year-old Filipino woman named Irene, who I met in the Philippines 9,000 miles away from home. There is no possible way that I could have ever met this woman before, though upon meeting her for the first time, I felt as if we already had a connection. I would find in time, after knowing Irene for a number of years, exactly why it was that we had the connection. Oh yes, she'd felt it upon our first meeting too. And I'm hoping it might make the hair on your arm stand up just as it did mine when I came to my answer. I'd been living in a very remote jungle village in Mindanao, the southernmost major island of the Philippines, for some time, and I met Irene at a time when I just about lost my mind, all of my money, and practically the shirt on my back. Acting as the universe so often does, it put me in touch with Irene at a time when I needed her most, and perhaps when she needed me, or at least needed to see me most. You see, there is a major gap of reality that exists between what many people in the Philippines, and in their defense, many non-white third world countries around the world, think about Western foreigners and the facts about us. To simplify this for the sake of saving time, it is assumed by many locals in these sorts of countries that if you are a white foreigner, then you are a rich American, and you'll do little more than waste your time and breath attempting to convince them otherwise. Let's say you are a Caucasian middle-class Canadian visiting the Philippines. Upon sight, the overwhelming majority of locals will assume you are a rich American. This would be the same if you were a Caucasian middle-class Australian or a lower-class Brit. And as frustrating as this can be, because it is then assumed that you should start shilling out the pesos for no reason other than because you have so many of them and they, the locals, don't, again, at least as they see it, it's not nearly as frustrating as trying to set the record straight. The more you claim not to be rich, the richer they think you are. Now, with all this said, you'll understand better the state of mind I was in when I met Irene, and why it was so important that I met her when I did. Basically, I'd had the joy of going through the same culture shock, we'll call it, though I could think of a much more colorful term for it, like fleecing perhaps, than many Western men experience when they get involved with a beautiful Filipino lady. Basically, when this happens, the entire family, immediate and extended alike, assume that they have just won the lottery, and the first thing they do is quit their jobs, if they have jobs. Then they write out their wish list, much like a child making their Christmas gift list, and then they give the list to the lady member of their family who has landed the whale. Yes, I am fucking serious. At any rate, this is what I'd had the lovely joy of experiencing. You know I'm being facetious, right? When I came to know Irene. I'd moved out into the jungle with my beautiful bride dearly and our son, who was only a few months old at the time, to be closer to her family so they could help us, and help they did. They helped themselves to me. Over a period of time that flew by, while at the same time feeling as if it were taking forever, I was fleeced by many of Dearly's family members of what little savings I had, and I was run into debt and obligated to pay creditors money I didn't have. This was done by a combination of lies and deceit to get the money I had, and borrowing being done in my name against my knowledge. I remember clearly the morning that the owner of a local Sari store, think convenience store if you've never been to the Philippines, approached me and told me that I owed her X amount of money. I can't remember the amount now, but it was a lot, especially for a crazy, drunken, down-and-out combat veteran lost in the Philippines. When I asked how it was that I'd come to owe her such a debt, she said, "You mean you didn't know?" "Know what?" I asked her. It turns out that many of Dearly's family members, immediate and extended, had been going to this woman's store for months, buying what they wanted and telling her to charge it to the family's foreigner. Yes, like you are an entity, nay, a possession, not a person, and let me tell you, that's exactly what you are made to feel like in these situations. A commodity. I've never felt like less of a human than my down-and-out years in the Philippines. Even being a trainee at basic training in the U.S. Army didn't compare. Upon finding all this out, I told the woman I refused to pay the debt since the debt was accrued without my knowledge. I stormed into the house and told Dearly I was leaving the village and that she could either grab the baby and come with me or she could stay behind and I would send her money to take care of the kid when I had some, but under no circumstances was I staying in that place for another day. Fortunately, Dearly bought my bluff, and she and our son, Daniel, left with me that day. There was no way in hell I would have actually left them, and I think she knew that, but I also think she was fully aware of the toll the experience had taken on me. And by the way, I would go on to pay the debt because as a non-Filipino national, I had no rights. Had I not paid it, I would have gone to jail, even though the debt, as I said, was run up completely without my knowledge and certainly without my approval. Next time you want to bitch about how bad things are in America, please remember this story. You can always move to a place like the Philippines if you don't like it here in the U.S. The next couple of years would be difficult as far as our family relations went, but over that period of time, Dearly's family learned some cold, hard truths, namely, not all Americans are rich, not all foreigners, as they call everyone who is not a Filipino, are Americans in the first place. And well, I guess they came to understand a little bit about conservatism and about how there is little, if any, white guilt among those who practice it. In time, her family members would go back to work and earn their own way through life once again, and in time, we all started our relationships with each other all over again. Today, I have a close, loving relationship with Dearly's parents and siblings, and I avoid her extended family like the plague they've shown themselves to be. They refuse to view me as anything other than a commodity to be used for their convenience, so they are no longer allowed into my life to any degree. Dearly, Daniel, and myself fled to a community 3 hours away from the jungle village where Dearly's family lived. I had one contact in our new community, the man known as Pizza the Hut. You see, on the first of the month, when I would receive what little bit of money I was earning as a writer at the time, it was literally between $100 and $300 monthly, but most months way closer to $100. We would have to make the 3 hours long trip by bus to this community in order to pull our funds out of an ATM machine. Yes, that is correct. The closest ATM machine where I could withdraw any money was a 3-hour bus ride away. I'd met Eric, or Pizza the Hut, and his wife on one of these trips. I started going to see him and the other foreigners at his bar when I'd go to town to get cash. This is the very bar and group of expats that we've already read about in previous stories in this work, like Winthrop and the Green Grass. These are these guys. It's like back before those stories took place, though. All of the expats that hung out at Eric's bar had been living in the Philippines for many years, and they'd all been fleeced in the beginning of their stays, just as I had. Eric and others at his business finally convinced me to get out of my situation, move to their town, and it was Eric who actually set up the meeting between Irene and me. I've already told her your situation, Eric told me when I mentioned to him that I didn't have any money to pay rent when I showed up, unannounced and unexpectedly, at his bar, after having fled from Dearly's family. She knows how it is here, Eric said of Irene. She understands you've been getting used for a while. She'll let you move in and pay her later. Dearly and I and our little baby boy Daniel, along with Eric and his wife, jumped into Eric's Jeep and went to Irene's. The entire time heading there, I was thinking, great, another wolf lying in wait to fleece the sheep. Boy, was I wrong. The first thing I noticed about Irene once we arrived at her house, aside from her obvious age and her significant degree of beauty, especially for someone her age, was her aura. It was so peaceful and inviting. It was as if she had a radiant glow about her, but I knew that Eric and his wife would not be able to see it. I couldn't help but notice my surroundings inside her home as well. Her home reeked of wealth. Irene was a woman of means, and not just by Filipino standards. She would have been considered well off in the U.S. It's okay, Irene said to me, a peaceful smile on her face as she did when I told her I wouldn't have the money to pay the rent for 2 more weeks. And by the way, we're talking about $75 a month. Yes, that's how much the little 2-bedroom house that actually had running water and electricity that we would rent from Irene for nearly 2 years cost us. $75 a month. And I couldn't afford it. No, you won't, Irene told me when I told her I'd pay interest and late fees for making her wait. In time, I would pay Irene the rent as well as the deposit, and I paid her every single month that we lived there. I looked forward to going to her house to give her the rent money every month, and what began as a once-monthly visit to do so would become a weekly trip, not to pay rent each time, of course, but to spend time with Irene. Irene, it turned out, had 3 siblings, 2 brothers and a sister. All 3 of her siblings were living in the U.S. Irene had traveled to the U.S. numerous times throughout her life. Her siblings had always tried to get her to live in the U.S., but she loved her native Philippines. It was so wonderful and comforting being able to spend time with a Filipina who knew so much about where I was from. She was instrumental in helping Dearly come to understand that in America, we have poor people. We have homeless people. Our people might be better off, for the most part, financially, but everyone with any amount of money has problems. In many ways, she was a mentor for Dearly, and she was a godsend for me. Let me tell you, this sidebar, you guys like my sidebars? I read this recently. I want to share this right now. Having money does not eliminate your problems. It just gives you options in dealing with them. The more money you have, the more options you're going to have access to in regard to dealing with your problems. But everybody the world over has problems, and my problem is that guy decided to start mowing his grass again. He's okay. He's over on the other side. Just ignore the lawnmower. Yeah, money doesn't solve problems. It just gives you more options in dealing with them, okay? It doesn't eliminate problems. Helps you more problems in solving them, more options in solving them. Just geared down. Since she was so advanced in age, Irene was able to tell stories of her experiences from back in World War II. She'd actually been alive, though not very old at the time, when Japanese forces invaded the islands. She clearly remembered running for the mountains with her entire village when this happened and staying hidden for years before returning to her community. I would sit and listen to Irene tell her stories as long as she was willing to tell them, and she would tell them until she became too physically, mentally, and emotionally tired to tell them anymore, at which point I'd leave, but never before, because despite the effort, I could tell she genuinely enjoyed telling the stories. I apologized once to her daughter, who was about my age, a surprise baby Irene had when she was in her early 50s, for always staying too long, and she just smiled and told me not to worry about it. She said her mother loved my visits and always looked forward to them. She said her mother would often say, "It would be nice if Kevin came by today," And she told me that oddly on many of those days she would say that, I would actually stop by. Looking back now, I'd quite comfortably guess that Irene was an empath, and she had a way of knowing things without necessarily knowing. After 2 years of living in Irene's rental house, it was time for us to move. Our financial circumstances had improved considerably. I'd won a writing award with Yahoo that had put me on the map with a story I'd written with a very strange pen. That is a story in and of itself, and it's one we'll save for later. But I had gone from being completely down and out in the jungles of the Philippines to having mainstream media personalities who most Americans saw regularly on their boob tubes at home FaceTiming me in the Philippines. By the way, another sidebar, there's a wonderful story about this pen coming up in the month of October, this October. I would sit with my laptop underneath our large mango tree, rather the large mango tree on Irene's property we were renting, doing the best I could to carry the conversation despite the terrible connection. These media personalities were contacting me to ask me to work for them, mostly as a Veterans Affairs correspondent. This allowed my family and me the ability to move on to a very large city where I would enjoy modern conveniences like running water and electricity on a more reliable basis. Though we'd left the jungle, in Irene's town we experienced 8-hour-long blackouts where none of our utilities would work all day, each day. It was the next stepping stone before we would be able to come to the United States not too long later. I'd already let Irene know the date we were leaving and we'd cleaned out the house properly, but still I stopped by early on the morning of our move to tell her goodbye one last time. I thanked her for being so kind to me and treating me like a human being rather than a commodity. I told her that I'd been literally about to lose my mind when I'd met her and she'd help me in more ways than just by providing my family and me a place to live. One of the biggest ways she helped was by having allowed me to see that there are many, many, many wonderful people in the Philippines who do not take advantage. Because during the time I knew her, Irene had also introduced me to many of her friends and family members, none of whom ever asked me for anything, and who would regularly invite my family and me to dinner at their homes, always sending us away at the end of the evenings with enough leftovers for us to eat for the next several days. Irene nearly single-handedly saved me from making the dreadful decision to hate an entire group of people based upon my having been mistreated by merely a handful of them. She was a testament not just to the Filipino people, but to humanity. I let Irene know all this during our last meeting, word for word, and it was only then that Irene confided in me that she'd felt a connection with me the first time she'd met me. "You reminded me so much of my father," she said. "Actually, the first time you walked into my house, I thought I was seeing his ghost. You look so much like him." "Was your father white?" I asked, wondering how I could remind this tiny Asian lady of her father so much. "Actually, he was half white American," she told me. I found it strange that of all the time I'd spent with Irene, she'd neglected to tell me of this fact. "And he had emerald green eyes, just like yours." "Wow," I said, and then Irene launched into her story of the last time she'd seen her father. "We'd made it to our hiding spot in the jungle," she said, speaking of the time when she and her entire village had fled the Japanese. "My father and most of the fighting-age men left us once they'd made sure we were all safely set up at our new location. They returned to our native village to fight the invaders. You remember the story of the October Rider? That was him. That was him. He just went by. Man, this fell is thin. And yes, that's a spray bottle. I just sprayed what trees I don't have in tree guards because the bucks are in rut and they're going by scraping them up to mark their territory. Wow. We just saw the October Rider. The veil is very, very thin and the spirits are coming out to hear their stories. This guy has written about them. You're 5 days late, brah. No, I'm not following him this time. Back to Irene's story. My father and most of the fighting age men left us once they made sure we were all safely set up at our new location. They returned to our native village to fight the invaders. I remember about 4 days after he left us, Irene continued. I was asleep. It was the middle of the night. I awakened with the feeling that I was being watched. In there, in our small hut, stood my father. He was staring at me, smiling. When he saw that I'd opened my eyes, he came over to me. He brushed my hair back out of my eyes and he kissed my forehead. He told me that he loved me, but that he had to go and that we would see each other again, but that it would be a long time before we did. He held his forefinger up to his lips as if to say shh, and then he stood, turned, and walked out of our hut, and in no time I went back to sleep. That was the last time I ever saw him. I'm so sorry to hear that, I told Irene. At least he died defending his land and his family. Not quite, Irene said. Like I've told you before, we remained in hiding until the war was over. When we returned to our village, my father was not there. Everyone claimed he never returned from our hiding location to fight, and everyone who had assumed he'd stayed behind to take care of the families. Everyone had assumed he stayed behind to take care of the families. We had no word on his whereabouts during our entire separation, and it was only when we'd returned to our village after the war that we'd found out he'd not made it back. However, after we had been back for about a year, a man who traveled regularly through the same rough mountain passes we'd used to get to our hiding spot during the invasion came to our village one day from a return trip. He came carrying a satchel that my father always had with him, as well as a set of horse reins. My mother identified both upon sight. She'd actually made the reins for my father. The old man told us that he'd found both beside a pit of quicksand. He said he'd found the skeletal remains of a horse, at least partly. The evidence made it quite obvious. My father never made it back to the village to help defend against the Japanese invaders. He'd been swallowed by the quicksand. I felt chills run up my spine when Irene told me this part of the story, realizing her father had actually come to see her after he'd obviously already perished. I stood there, silent, allowing it all to sink in. I watched as a single tear ran down one of Irene's cheeks. I instinctively went to her and leaned forward and hugged her as she sat in her favorite chair. I know that how this is going to sound, she said as we parted. I mean, we finally knew what had happened to him, and we knew without doubt that he died in that quicksand. But that last time I saw him, he told me no matter how long it took, he would come back for me, and under no circumstances believe otherwise. Papa told me to never stop waiting for him, and I never have. Doesn't that sound silly? It doesn't sound silly at all, I told her. I also told her I would call to say hello from time to time, and she gave me a knowing smile. She knew I'd never call, just as well as I did. However, we were both wrong. I would call in time, only Irene would never know this. About 6 months after my family and I had left Irene's community and had gone to the city, I did call to speak with Irene. I wanted to let her know how well my family and I were doing and that it looked like we'd be heading to the U.S. soon. I wanted to know how she was getting along as well. Irene's daughter answered the phone. Sadly, her daughter informed me that Irene had passed. I told her I was sorry to hear that, and she told me not to be. Her mother had lived for nearly a century, and she'd had an amazing life. It was odd, her daughter said. I just couldn't sleep the night she died. It's not as if I knew it was time for my mother to pass, she said, but I honestly thought I heard footsteps in our house. I listened intently as Irene's daughter told this brief tale of the night of her mother's passing. And then, she continued, at one point I heard my mother call out, but not for me. Papa, she'd said. I went to her room to check on her, and she had already passed, her daughter continued. But she had such a peaceful smile on her face. It was tranquil. I didn't even cry because I knew she'd gone peacefully, and it had been her time. The world is a better place because Irene had been in it. She'd been a positive influence in the lives of all who knew her, and my life was more enriched because of a brief period that she had been in mine. The end. Hope you enjoyed this story. It was a beautiful story, in my opinion. I'm biased, I wrote it, but it's a very true story. And Irene was a very beautiful woman. See you for more tomorrow.